if you guys love smallmouth, like I love smallmouth and even largemouth, and you want to see them around so that you can fish them for decades and your kids and your grandkids can fish them for decades, then you might just want to listen and get some education tonight. I got a couple of good guests coming on, and we're going to talk about why, smallmouth may be in a precarious position in some parts of this country, and who knows how far it could go. And we're going to talk about what that threat is. And then at the end, maybe we'll even talk about some just general fisheries questions. So I'm going to bring in our experts. Now, I'm not going to sit here and bloviate and make stuff up. I'm bringing people that really know what they're talking about fisheries. So we've got Lawrence Dorsey and Steve Sammons. What's going on, guys?
Hey, good evening.
Beautiful evening.
Cool. Yeah, awesome. So we'll just start. We'll give the guys. So first of all, tonight's HellaBass Live presented by Arsenal Fishing, boosted by Powerhouse Lithium as always. There's some discount codes down in the bottom and some links if anybody wants to support the stream and support the partners. But otherwise, we're going to get into talking about what the threat is to smallmouth bass. But first, we're going to let Lawrence and Steve introduce themselves so you know that they got a little bit of credibility and it's just some random guys talking about this. So Lawrence, why don't you go first, and then Steve, you can go next.
Sure. Thanks again for having us. Like I told you earlier, full disclaimer, I'm fighting the crud a little bit here, so my voice is a little bit off. Do the best I can. I think I'll be okay. But I'm Lawrence Dorsey. I'm currently a regional fishery supervisor with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. I've spent 26 years with the agency, held several different positions. I started out as an assistant district biologist, did that for about 3 years. I was up in the northwest corner of North Carolina where I got to work on the New River, the headwaters of the New River, which is pretty cool. So that's really good smallmouth water. It's even better when you get into Virginia, but it's good smallmouth water in North Carolina. Then I promoted down to the Piedmont, the center part of the state, and spent the bulk of my career as a district fisheries biologist, working on reservoirs, working on black bass, which I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit later on as to how I got involved with Alabama bass. And then within the last couple of years, I promoted once to regional research coordinator. Did that for about 3 years, and then for almost 2 years, getting close to 2 years, I've been a regional fishery supervisor here. So and now the folks that work with me do a lot of the groundwork, but they're out there doing the work right now on assessing our bass populations, and particularly as it relates to the spread of Alabama bass. So again, glad to be here tonight. And another disclaimer: Steve and I have known each other, worked together for, golly, it's getting close to 30 years. And so, our careers intersected a long time ago, and, it's not the topic we probably wanted them to intersect on again, but they have. And so here we are.
All right, Steve.
So, I am currently a research fellow at Auburn University. I run a fisheries lab here that we kind of, I don't want to say specialize, that might be a wrong word, but we have done an awful lot of native black bass work in the last 15 years, particularly. Before that, I was mostly a reservoir person. My background is in sport fish management. I went to Virginia Tech for my undergraduate, South Dakota State for my master's work. Worked at Tennessee Tech for 5 years, which is where Lawrence and I ran into each other. He got his master's degree working on the project that I was kind of supervising. And then I made my way down here to Auburn, where I did my PhD and haven't left.
Yes.
So like I said, I've worked on an awful lot of bass species. And I'm living in the state where Alabama bass are actually native, which is getting to be an increasingly small part of where they're actually found.
Cool. So, and I guess for the people that really want to see the science and get into the stats and the graphs and all that stuff, I do have a link to their research findings and papers. It's probably a little dry for a live stream, but for those that are really interested and want to test the science, and I'm sure I think your guys' probably contact info and stuff is on there as far as people want to reach out and have questions. But I guess let's see here before we let's see. Chuck Murray wants to say, "Hey, Lawrence." So Brian
Chuck.
says we all sound good and look good. So there you go. Don't have to worry about your voice, Lawrence. They're saying sounds good. But I guess Aaron, the question is, what are smallmouth and to some degree largemouth, I think, under attack? You've kind of mentioned it, but like explain kind of a high level intro. What is the problem and what are we worried about here?
Now I'm gonna let Steve give you just a little bit of history on Alabama bass because, like he said, he lives and has worked for many years where they're native to, which is it's a good thing. And then talk a little bit about the spread issue, and then I can start talking about some case history stuff that we've seen recently.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing we should say, what is an Alabama bass? So black bass management and biology, ecology has undergone a pretty significant revolution in the last 15 years, mostly in nomenclature and taxonomy. As our analytical methods increase, particularly genetics, we were able to revisit some things that were suggested or postulated 50, 60, 70 years ago by folks who wandered around the Southeast just picking up bass and saying, hey, this looks like this looks like that. And some of these fish kind of look pretty similar, but there's subtle differences. So these guys, most of that work was done by two folks named Bailey and Hubbs. That's their last names. They are really the grandfathers, for the most part, of black bass taxonomy. And they're notable in that this all happened in the 40s. And so everything they did was nothing with genetics. It was all basically field biologists going out, splashing around in streams, catching these fish, and doing very minute detailed work on them about like how many scales do they have down their lateral line, how many fin rays do they have, all that kind of stuff. And so they could go so far and no farther, kind of a thing, if you will. And so in the late 2000s, certain people started revisiting some of this and tacking on, like, they would say things in some of their old manuscripts like, we think something's going on here and someone should look at it. And I think they suspected that might happen before the end of World War II, but it actually didn't happen until the 21st century. I mean, literally, it got put on a shelf and forgotten. And so Alabama bass is one of those new species that used to be considered a subspecies of spotted bass. Spotted bass used to be separated into two subspecies. The northern spotted bass, which a lot of folks call Kentucky spotted bass, and the Alabama spotted bass, which was really found pretty much in Alabama. They're native to the Mobile Basin, which is about 75% of Alabama. It's all the rivers that come together and exit into the Gulf of Mexico via the Mobile River and the Mobile Bay.
So a lot of people also for a while called them coosas, right? That's same
That's
fish,
right.
right?
So the Coosa River is one of the bigger rivers in the Mobile Basin. It happens to have a series of big reservoirs along it that are real popular for fishing. And so it grows these things pretty big. And so because I suspect this is what was going on anyway, it's always hard to tell where colloquial names come from because, of course, it's just an organic thing that happens over time. But because the Coosa River reservoirs were kicking out all these big fish, I think they tended to just start making it Coosa spots, or something like that. So I've heard them called that.
At least in like what I would say in like in the tournament bass fishing culture, right? You would say Kentucky's or regular spotted bass, or you'd have like Coosa bass or Coosa spotted bass. And that was how, so I mean, like if you've been in, fishing tournaments in the last 10, 20 years, that's typically the delineation. Up until now, I would say within maybe the last 5 years, I'm starting to hear this emphasis on the Alabama bass.
Right. Yeah. So they were formally described as far back, way back in, I think, 2008 or 7. I don't remember which. But it takes a while for that to catch on. Heck, even for us. I mean, Georgia currently is right now going back into their database and formally changing all their stuff from the Mobile Basin into Alabama bass. They just kept it as spotted bass. But this is one of those things where, okay, we almost certain that they were new species, different species. It's just no one ever bothered to do it. So if people who fish for these fish in general, like spotted bass in general, okay, so the Kentucky ones, the ones that we had in Tennessee that Lawrence and I worked on when we were there, and he was part of his master's work. So we sampled a reservoir for 6 years, 7 years, everything known to mankind, collected thousands and thousands of fish. Biggest one we ever saw was 16, maybe 17 inches. They were 8, 9 years old. You come down the Mobile Basin, they get 6 pounds, 7 pounds. They grow as fast as largemouth bass. They're geographically separated. So, spotted bass, the Kentuckys are in the upper, middle, and lower Mississippi River Basin and a few Gulf Coast streams over in like Texas. And the Alabama bass were only in the Mobile Basin. They never, ever mixed, if you will. And so that's another thing that can tell you about species. And the more we're looking, that's what a lot of these species that we have now are breaking down along geographic boundaries of river basins where they never mixed. So that's kind of where we were. And in the late 2000s, I started working on an endemic black bass found in the Apalachicola Basin called shoal bass. They're a river fish. They superficially resemble smallmouth bass. They probably don't get as big as smallmouth bass in that, when I say big, I mean the really big ones, like, the 8 to 10 pound smallmouth bass. You do not see that for shoal bass. However, they reach 5 to 6 pounds much more commonly than smallmouth bass do. And one of the things we saw is we started seeing a lot of this intergression of Alabama bass and spotted bass, especially in the Chattahoochee River, which is the western part of that basin that borders Alabama. It is literally the next basin over from the Mobile Basin going east. So they're real close to each other. They had been put in there probably in the late or early 70s was the first time they found Alabama bass. The spotted bass, the Kentucky bass, if you will, had been in there a little bit earlier, like 50s, 60s is the first time they were found. And they were intergressing with shoal bass to a pretty significant degree in the Chattahoochee. And they started, we looked at some red-eye bass or another whole group of bass that live in small streams. There are different species as well. And some of the cases they're having problems with those over in the Savannah River Basin, which is the border between South Carolina and Georgia. There's a species of red-eye bass there. It's still not described yet, but it's called the Bartram's bass, colloquially, after William Bartram, who was a naturalist that roamed the area in the early or late 1800s. That one of their main threats is intergression with Alabama bass that folks put in the big reservoirs that are along the border of those two states on the Savannah River. The problem is they don't stay there. They run up the streams and they're so we'd seen that. And we knew one of the things that's true. I've told this folks before, one of the weird things if you're in fisheries is when you learn for the first time that what we call bass are actually in the sunfish family. They're not actually true bass. That would be more like striped bass or white bass, or most of the true bass are actually purely marine. And it always seemed weird to me that, crappies are sunfish. And then of course, all the sunfish are sunfish, right? And they all have that little pan shape to them and all. And then you have these bass that are torpedo shaped with these big mouths. They get really big and they're sunfish too. And it's like, oh, that's really kind of weird. Well, one of the things we know about sunfish, they hybridize readily. Anyone who has ponds and has a couple species of sunfish in there know that pretty much you have 2 species of sunfish, if you do, let's just say, and you have a whole bunch of hybrids too. They commonly do that. Well, the truth is that's what bass do too. All you have to do is move one from one place to another outside their range. And the first thing they start doing is hybridizing with the locals. And so we knew this. And here's these streams and rivers where this is a problem. But like in the case of the Chattahoochee, they've been there for 50 years and we're just starting to study them. So we don't really know how much time it took for us to get to here, you know. And so I happen to be, one of the other things I have is that I am an editor of a journal, a scientific journal, a regional scientific journal. And in 2015, I believe it was, a manuscript hits my desk from Lawrence about one of his reservoirs. And that changed everything as far as I'm concerned about what in the world is going on with these Alabama bass. And so there's my segue to hand it off to Mr. Dorsey.
And promise you, like, we'll get to this. I think to people in, like, I don't know, Kansas, Minnesota, out west, maybe the Northeast, or wherever. Like this, I think we'll tie this all together on why almost all of us should be paying attention to this. And so, just kind of a segue. Like, this is not just a North Carolina, Alabama problem. We'll get there, but we need to build up to it. So, this isn't important education. This isn't like super sexy Gerald Swindle talking about buzz baits, but I think this is important stuff for all of us to understand. So go ahead, Lawrence.
No, that's fine. And one guy that I listen to on some internet podcast has what he calls the "so what" moment, and we're going to try to get to the "so what" moment here soon. As Steve mentioned, you know, working on reservoirs down here. I was working on Lake Norman, which, if you followed MLF, they were just here back in the spring, and their Red Crest event was here. Largest reservoir in the state of North Carolina, that's solely contained in the state of North Carolina, 32,000 acres. It's a little bit of a misnomer. It's in the Piedmont, which is traditionally has a lot of productive reservoirs. High Rock Lake is another one that several Bassmaster Classics back in the 90s on. I also managed that lake for a while, so I'm real familiar with it. But Norman never functioned like a productive reservoir. It's a very nutrient limited reservoir. And so when you go back and you look at the history of it, it was impounded in the mid 60s or the early 60s. When you start looking in the 70s, people were already complaining about how the bass fishing out there was terrible, the largemouth fishing, because that's all we had. And if you fast forward to the 80s, you start seeing some things in the files about anglers wanting spotted bass. And because the largemouth weren't doing very good, and they thought, well, if we just get these spotted bass, you know, and it never really said what kind of spotted bass, but then you started hearing rumblings about Coosa bass. You know, what if we get these Coosa bass? And again, journal or magazine articles, word of mouth, these fish, you know, if we can just put them in here, they'll do great, because they're doing great in the Coosa drainage. And Lake Norman looks a little bit, some of these reservoirs look a little bit similar. So, and we kept saying to the anglers, don't do this. This is not a good idea. We're not going to do it. But lo and behold, about 2000 to 2001, we found the first, what at the time we thought were spotted bass. Again, Steve talked about the genetics. It really wasn't until about 2013, 2014 that we were able to use genetics to confirm them as Alabama bass. But the whole time, once we found these fish in the lake, an initial sample from Duke Energy, who's a lake operator who has an environmental science program there, all of a sudden, when you started talking to the biologists there and we started seeing it, the Alabama bass numbers just kept shooting up. And so when we look at their data, which is in that paper, which is long-term sampling data where they go out every year and sample the same sites, by 2007, you had a flip in the reservoir. And what do I mean by that? I mean, there were more Alabama bass in their surveys than there were largemouth bass. And within about 4 to 5 years later after that, the jump was tremendous. It was a tremendous divergence between catch rates. And the sad news is we've never seen those lines cross back again. We've never seen largemouth come back to their pre-invasion levels. So that was a huge red flag. And that was really the genesis of the manuscript, was talking to the Duke Energy biologist, which one of them's a co-author on that first paper that Steve talked about. And I said, we got to get this out. And they were willing to let me kind of run with it. Same time all this is going on, we're starting to see these Alabama bass, again, what we've now found to be Alabama bass in other places in the state, affecting other systems that had largemouth in them. Sidebar to that is that we share water with Georgia, Lake Chattooga, and talking to their folks, they're like, "Hey, we've got these spotted bass in there. They're going nuts, and our smallmouth bass in this reservoir are going away." And by the time I got on the scene in the late '90s, smallmouth bass had virtually disappeared from Lake Chattooga. And so, again, start tracking this thing, start talking to our other biologists, and then fast forward to the about 5 years ago, we started a statewide black bass genetics survey, and it had several goals. One was to look at the proportion of Florida bass genes versus northern genes and largemouth. That was one of the goals, but also to look at these other species like smallmouth bass, spotted bass, which we do have a few native populations of those, because we were seeing what we thought were hybrids, but really, as Steve mentioned, the only conclusive way to do that is through genetics. And when we started getting these genetic results back, and especially comparing them to the field calls, what the biologist in the field was calling a smallmouth, and seeing that we didn't have as many pure smallmouth out there as we thought we did, and a lot of Alabama bass genes, particularly in western North Carolina. So when we track all this, what we've seen over time, to kind of give you the nutshell version, is if an Alabama bass gets into a system with largemouth bass and there are no smallmouth there in that system, i.e. a Lake Norman, a Ballew's Lake, which is another lake in North Carolina, a Moss Reservoir, which is a smaller lake close to Lake Norman but in a different drainage, if they have the opportunity, they're going to run the largemouth into kind of the shallows, into the very shallow areas of the reservoir that are muddy, turbid, productive areas of the reservoir where they don't seem to like that habitat, particularly the silty, clay bottom, turbid water. That's one impact. And that's not to be taken lightly, because it has had some dramatic effects in some of our reservoirs. The bigger one, and probably the one that your viewers, particularly those in the Midwest and going out into the West where our smallmouth bass populations are, outstanding and they're native, is what Steve talked about, is the introgression and the genetic swamping, where you get Alabama bass in these systems. Not only are they competing, but they're interbreeding. And so over time, what you had is pure smallmouth slowly but surely become pure Alabama bass. And it takes a while. Some cases it's quick in the sense of what you would think a time series should be. But Steve can comment on this a little bit as we go along. But Georgia, these North Georgia reservoirs have already seen that. They just don't have any more smallmouth left in them. And they got Alabama bass, 25, 30 years ago in them. No one's really sure of the timeline there completely. But that's the bigger so what in all this is, if these fish get into a system where they're smallmouth bass, there's a high likelihood that they're going to interbreed, and it's not going to go well for the smallmouth bass.
So we've got, just to kind of like back, so we got two things, right?
Yep.
We've got displacement of native species because they're seem to, in certain environments, they're thriving and they're out competing, right? And we also have intermixing, and they're also displacing through that, where they're basically, and maybe talk a little bit about how that works. And like, I think some of us are familiar with the mean mouth, right? Which was such a largemouth and a spot. Or is that what is the mean mouth?
Smallmouth in the spot they're in Alabama, really here. When we start looking at what our mean mouths are, they're smallmouth crossed with Alabama bass.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they're not. Are they always Alabamas, or are they ever?
Well, they can be the other one, the Kentuckys.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because like you see them in like the Ozarks, right? And that's more likely a Kentucky at that point. Okay.
So I think the question too you were wanting to know is, do they ever hybridize with largemouth? And we've seen that in limited cases, but what seems to happen is when they partition themselves in the reservoir into certain areas, there's just not that ability. They're not in the same places anymore to have that interbreeding. And that usually the first 5 years, we'll see some limited hybrids between largemouth and Alabamas in our surveys. But once we get about 5 to 10 years, Lake Norman's a perfect example of that. We haven't seen any of those in our genetic surveys that we were doing in the 2017, 2018 timeframe, 15, 17 years after the invasion. We just don't see them anymore. But we definitely see the smallmouth in Alabama crosses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how does this happen? And now I'm not a geneticist either. there is a really interesting study that was done in South Carolina. Um, and it was on the Savannah River Reservoir, as I mentioned earlier. So those reservoirs got their Alabama bass a good decade to a decade and a half earlier than North Carolina, if not
I
more.
guess when you say Savannah River, are those like Hartwell and Clarks Hill?
Hartwell,
Okay.
Clark Hill, Strom Thurmond, um,
Kiowee.
yeah, Kiowee,
Yep.
right. And so they've had a little bit longer to do their damage, and they've been studying them a little bit longer. And honestly, the reason they were studying them is because of that Bartram's bass, because that's what we call an endemic species. It's only found in the Savannah Basin completely. I mean, that's the only place that it disappear from there, they're extinct. And so obviously, South Carolina has been very proactive about trying to figure out what's going on here. And and basically when they start hybridizing, is what they found is that um, the hybrids. I guess the one thing for sure we ought to mention. So fish generally are not like mammals or something like that, where hybrids are sterile. That's not the case usually. They're perfectly capable of reproducing. They might have reduced reproductive fitness, but they're certainly not sterile, and they commonly reproduce. Um, and so they reproduce with either parental species, or they can reproduce with each other. And either way, they pass those genes down through generations. And as they keep um, as they slowly eliminate the pure fish that you want, the one that was there, as more and more hybrids are being produced, you have a whole bunch of the pure invader, the Alabama bass, and you start to have an increased number of hybrids. And the likelihood is that the hybrids are going to cross with the parentals and never with the one that's going away, because there are just not as many of them. And through time, they literally assimilate the native genes into all the fish, and they slowly just fade out, just because of each generation there's fewer genes. And through time, they've shown this in some of those reservoirs, uh, and not nearly as long as you would think. Like a 10 to 15-year window, it can go from having half hybrids and half pure fish to having 90% hybrids and 10% fish, and then it's not far from extinction at that point.
Right.
So it's one of those kind of scary little things that happens completely beneath the notice of not just anglers, but us. If we didn't have genetics, I mean, a lot of the hybrids, they don't have to look like hybrids. Now, when we think of like a mean mouth, that's a great example. They think of mean mouths, what we're usually talking about is what geneticists would call an F1, which just means they're the first generation. So the mean mouth is, mom is a smallmouth, dad was a spotted bass. So those are actually pretty easy to tell, because they're 50-50 roughly. And so they often have kind of intermediate characteristics. But if one of those, let's just say, hybridize or crosses with one of the parents, then all of a sudden they can start, once those gene proportions deviate from 50-50 and start becoming 60-40 or 70-30 or something like that, then you have a lot of fish that are quote unquote hybrids that can look very much like one of the parentals species. And so that's typically what actually happens, because you only have the 50-50s for a short time, because they all start hybridizing with each other, and very quickly it becomes a mess. And
Yeah.
so
And a lot of times these hybrids are not desirable, right? They don't grow as big. Right? They don't flourish, right? They tend to start to be stunted and right? Like
well, they can be, right, and so um Alabama bass are a weird animal in that. So you have the Coosa River. basin, which we talked about earlier, and you have all these big fish in there. I mean, there's big 4 and 5s and even 6-pounders. Every once in a while, something a little bit bigger. Lawrence mentioned about productivity earlier. The fact is the Coosa River system is a very productive river for whatever reason, the geology or whatever. I mean, everything grows fast in those reservoirs. They all have phenomenal crappie fisheries. You don't hear much about them because everyone talks about the bass, right? But I mean, they have great hybrid striped bass and striped bass fisheries. They have fabulous sunfish fisheries. They have great catfish fisheries. So, that's a misnomer to think that it's the fish doing it. It's the location doing it.
And those fish have, to some degree, evolved for decades to thrive in that ecosystem.
Yeah. I mean, so the two main, well, I guess on the upper half of the Mobile Basin, the two main rivers that come together to form the Alabama River is the Coosa, which everyone's heard about, and the Tallapoosa, which almost no one's heard about unless you're here. I mean, they're literally a valley away with some high ground in between them that separates them into two rivers, and they join each other just outside of Montgomery and become the Alabama River. Well, the geology of the Tallapoosa is different. It is nowhere near as productive as the Coosa River, even though they're right next to each other. They're within 50 miles of each other at all times. Yet you go into the Tallapoosa River and a 4-pound Alabama bass is memorable. Most of them are 2 and 3 pounds because the nutrients aren't there. And the fact is, at least here in the Southeast, most of the lakes that the Alabama bass tend to do well in, and when I say well, I mean numerically, tend to be the ones with the lesser nutrients. And so what you have here, because now smallmouth bass, right, they don't do that as much. They now think of Dale Hollow Reservoir, and think, you could think certainly of all the natural lakes up where you are, where, they actually aren't usually that productive. A lot of them border on what we call oligotrophic, which is the lowest nutrient level there is. And yet they get 5 pounds commonly. And it's no big deal for a smallmouth bass, Well, Alabama bass don't seem to be that way for whatever reason. And so if you think about the hybrids, what you're doing is you're crossing a fish that in these conditions can get 6 or 7 pounds with a fish that's probably going to top out at 3 or 4, and that's going to hurt your growth. And that tends to be what happens there. And so, and that's where we worry about that for other things as well. I mean, the shoal bass are the same way. They grow really quickly if you leave them alone, but the hybrids don't seem to get as big because they can't. And that problem's even more exacerbated if it's the Kentucky bass that people move around. And that, which is the problem we have in the Chattahoochee, is that they're all a mix of everything anyway. But the Kentucky bass grow like nothing. I mean, like I said, 15 inches is about their top end. I mean, that's an 8 or 9 year old fish, and they only live to like 10, like most.
Yeah, 3 to 3.5 pounds is about the max you're going to get that I've seen on a spotted bass, on a true spotted bass.
Yeah, and so if they cross with something, they absolutely kill the growth. Because they're one of the slowest growing black bass species, to be honest. And so that's usually what happens if you have a hybrid. I mean, you can have a little bit of hybrid vigor, but it seems to be fleeting. It seems to be fleeting. And some of Lawrence's and North Carolina's data, where they've looked at this more in depth, can tell, from what I remember, and he can tell me if I'm wrong, but I mean, initially, you see 3 and 4 and maybe even 5 pound Alabama bass. And then as the population increases and starts to get to equilibrium, those babies are gone for the most part. Because they were probably done in a vacuum, in a low density thing where all the food was in the world. So they grow big. And then, they're very successful at reproducing. They are like Kentucky spotted bass and Alabama bass seem to be two of the species of bass that can really live in a wide variety of places. You can catch them in streams that are just completely wadable. You can catch them in giant rivers like the Ohio River for Kentucky bass. And they live in small reservoirs. They live in big reservoirs. Some of the work that Lawrence did for his master's degree, we were looking at what controls bass recruitment, reproductive success in this reservoir, which has 3 native species of bass: smallmouth, largemouth, and spots. There weren't really enough smallmouth bass in that reservoir for us to do it on those. But we pretty much figured out what the heck was going on with the largemouth bass. I mean, it really was water levels in the spring. If they're high, they have a really good year, and if it's low, they don't. And it has to do with shoreline covers and all that. Spotted bass in that reservoir did not matter. They reproduced if the water was low. They reproduced if it was high. It didn't matter. We never did figure out exactly why that is. I mean, but the implication is that they're not tied to the shoreline as much as largemouth bass, and that just points to the resiliency of this fish. And so that's another problem is that there are some places they don't seem to make it, but those are the minority. This is like the kudzu of bass, which is what my wife calls it. It literally can grow almost anywhere.
Yeah, that's I mean, to echo that is the problem. And at least in my state, I know in Tennessee and Virginia now, certainly South Carolina and Georgia, these fish are not being moved by fisheries management agencies. And that's a point that, it's one of those, you hate to be accusatory, but it's the truth. They're being moved by people. Certainly, once you get them in a river basin in a reservoir and it's high in that drainage, if there's multiple reservoirs like the Savannah or any of our reservoirs here in the Catawba system, they're going to move downstream. They just are. I mean, naturally. But when you have these interbasin movements, when they're moved from one basin to another, we didn't move them. That anglers are moving them, and that's something that we really want to press hard on if we can is don't move these fish. It's as Steve said, some places they get dumped in, they don't make it. You just don't see them that much. We were talking about this today on the phone. I'm not really sure of any success stories of moving these fish. No one's told me of one where all of a sudden the fishery was greater. There might be a short-term burst, as he mentioned. We saw that at Norman with some bigger fish. We had a state record. What we thought, again, pre-genetic work was a spotted bass that was caught out of there. I bet if I went back and pulled genetic samples, I know it would be an Alabama bass because we've never caught a spotted bass out of Lake Norman. But that was fleeting, as Steve said. And so you get this short-term burst, and then you get these long-term problems that, you're kind of stuck with. And the fish has moved west into Tennessee, across, North Carolina, across the Blue Ridge into Tennessee. It's in a lot of East Tennessee reservoirs now. They're not happy, Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, about having to deal with this. They see some of their really good smallmouth fisheries like Dale Hollow, Norris, Center Hill, that people are familiar with, that are, they're candidates for someone dumping these things in and causing a lot of havoc. I mean, a lot of havoc. So, I don't understand it because in my mind, like Steve said, I worked on spotted bass years ago, loved them, working on them. But, the biggest spotted bass never got as big as the biggest largemouth bass. And that's true with Alabama bass. And what we see in a lot of these reservoirs is, like Steve said, there's a bunch of pound and a half fish swimming around out there. You're looking for numbers, you'll catch them. If you saw the MLF tournament, when they had cameras on about every boat, they were catching a lot of them. They didn't catch many big ones, and there were a lot of fish that weren't scoreable that were released. I don't really have, they didn't keep track of that, or at least if they did, I haven't seen it. They may have, but that just goes to show you that, when you get these fish in, they're, as Steve mentioned earlier, you can't pick the Coosa River reservoirs up and move them somewhere and expect, the same thing to happen. It's just not going to happen.
So I don't know if you guys know the answer to this, but I believe the big spots out in California, those are the Alabama bass, right? But that was a government, right? The California did that, right? That wasn't bucket biology, right? That was a organized effort by the fisheries in California.
Correct. So California, the whole western half of the country, None of the bass are native. And so these were decisions made a long time ago. They actually brought quite a few different bass species in there. They brought, of course, largemouth, and they brought their smallmouth bass in there. They have spotted bass. I don't know why, but they did. And they brought in Alabama bass. And there's even some red eyes in one river down in Southern California that I have no idea what anyone was thinking there. They get 10 inches long. They're pretty, but they're not something you would put in there. And so in their cases, their justification for that, I'm sure, was here's all these artificial reservoirs that were created on these rivers. The rivers didn't have anything in them that transitioned the reservoirs. The rivers out there, you don't have a lot of native sport fish out west. If you take away the trout, the salmonids, there's nothing for the most part. And so back in the day, it wasn't that uncommon for agencies to say, well, we need to create fisheries here. And so they did. And as you know, I mean, some of those are extremely successful in terms of what they've created. I mean, not even talking about Alabama bass. Think of the, what is that? The Sacramento Delta area where there's 12, 15-pound largemouth bass. Well, I mean, they were originally put in there. They did quite well. So some of those reservoirs in the eastern part of California and outside of the Sierras and the Central Valley and all that, like Bullard's Bar, one of them, they grow really big in there because they eat trout. Same reason why an off like Clear Lake has all those giant largemouth bass in it, because they're trout eaters. One thing we know for sure for anything, whether you're talking striped bass or muskies or whatever, one of the most tasty morsels for all of ever to create giant fish is trout. If you can get them eating that, I don't know. Apparently they must be a million calories per trout because they really can grow some fish. And so those fish out there in California, those ones that you get all the headlines, the press, the 10-pounders, the 11-pounders that absolutely destroyed the current world record that was from its native range for a long time, 8 pounds and I think 3 ounces from Lewis Smith Lake, right here in Alabama. I mean, it destroyed that by 3 or 4 pounds, which is just crazy.
And they were breaking it like every other weekend for a while.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so they're growing fish far beyond anything that we have in their native range. But it's a very specialized situation.
Yeah, and I think that was the later that they introduced those, right? And then like Rich here says that Nascimento lost its smallmouth. So, there are the Bullard's Bar and the New Maloney's that have these great stories, but it sounds like there was smallmouth and other bass that were displaced, within that too. So
that's so typical. I mean, I tell folks this all the time. When something expands, something else loses. Generally. I mean, sometimes we can't tell what it is, but something loses. You usually don't have a situation where you can just have a fish expand and take over and everybody else is happy too. That's rare. Usually somebody's going to lose. And the one thing that, the largemouth bass thing to me was really surprising because until Lawrence's study, I thought they were bulletproof. I didn't think anything could kick largemouth bass out. Really? I mean, they are also a very adaptable critter. I mean, obviously, they're found in 1-acre ponds to Lake Erie. They're found everywhere. And the thought that something could come into a 30,000-acre reservoir and in the course of a decade, literally kick largemouth bass to the curb and say, see ya, this is our home now, was shocking to me, So that's really interesting that they could do that. And we're still not sure what the mechanism is there. But the terrifying part is what they do to the other bass species with the genetic stuff. Because there ain't no going back from that. We're watching smallmouth bass fisheries disappear in real time. And what I mean by that is like every year they look, there's fewer, which is like, oh my God, and so, and it's again, that same scale thing. I mean, our friend, John Hammonds, who works for Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, we have like a twice a year call, which is really kind of a sob story almost of, how crappy is our day now, thing. But basically, they're watching the smallmouth bass disappear from Watts Bar Reservoir, which is the top reservoir in the Tennessee River chain and is not a small place. I actually haven't looked it up to see how big it is, but I've been on it. It's got to be 40,000 acres, if not more. And I mean, how could you imagine that someone could throw something into a lake like that and just in 10 years watch a native smallmouth bass just go away? And so it's a real threat. And the scale had escaped me looking at what we were seeing here with the shoal bass and the red-eye bass in admittedly smaller streams, isolated rivers, stuff like that. You know, and then we started seeing this reservoir stuff, and one of the things in a biologist framework. So rivers are hard to sample, streams are even harder to sample, and we don't tend to have time series data. We go whenever we can, or we go for a very specific purpose or something like that. The one thing that the reservoirs were able to give us that the river stuff didn't is the timing, because a lot of these reservoirs get sampled every single year using the same gear at the same time of year by the states, and it's there for a very good reason. Or a very definitive purpose. It's to track population trends, and their data in North Carolina, and then we had some from Tennessee. We have some from South Carolina and from Georgia. They show the repeated pattern of not only is it a total takeover, it's an incredibly rapid takeover. By the time they reach a level that you detect them in your sampling gear, it's already too late.
Yeah.
Because the snowball is rolling down and is already halfway to being an avalanche.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a question I saw earlier. I don't know. Is there a way as an angler you can tell the difference between a Alabama bass and a Kentucky? And is there anything anglers should be doing at a local level if you can?
So yes, there is a way. It's not a pretty way, but it is actually a way. They have different lateral line scale counts, and they have different around the tail scale counts. I'd have to pull that up to see exactly what it is, which I can do while we're talking actually. But basically, Alabama bass have more, and they do not overlap. So when I say it's not pretty, but it is definitive, a lot of times these counts in fish will overlap. Like, and what I mean is that like the range is like, let's just say 60 to 75 for one fish and 55 to 65 for the other fish. Well, there's a lot of leeway there where you could get those intermediate. Well, these things don't overlap. And so that's a pretty good way of telling them apart. There's a little bit of markings that are different, but I don't trust color because color really is variable. Fish can change their color like that. And so the fish you catch does not often look like the same fish when you put it in live well for 3 hours. It's like has done something because they can change their markings a little bit, their color. So I kind of stay away from that. Although in the official description they do, on average, spotted bass, their lateral blotches that go down the side kind of coalesce into a line right before they hit a tail. And the Alabama bass generally continue to be blotches all the way down to the tail. But again, that is not something I would use because I've caught Kentuckys in places where they had to be Kentuckys because that's their native range that have the blotches all the way down. And I've caught Alabama bass that have that line. So,
Right.
But, well, and just to throw in kind of the management side of it, I mean, so in our state, spotted bass, not Alabama bass, are native to just a small fraction of the southwestern part of the state. And so when we started getting all these and to the point of how do you tell them apart, we made the decision from a management perspective to just open up Alabama bass and spotted bass size and creel limits. There's no size or creel limits on either one of them right now. So there's not a burden on anglers to make a decision. And, that some of this is forcing our hands a little bit about how we do regulations, because in some of these reservoirs in Western North Carolina, it's a fair question. Now, what is a smallmouth? Is what, we thought are smallmouth. I mean, again, when we sample these fish in the field, pull a fin clip on them, send them off to a genetics lab, and we assign them a species, because typically that's what it is. And sometimes we might put hybrid down, but we really don't know. And I know Tennessee, talking to John, they're having the same discussions about some of their fish, as they go along. How are we going to manage these fish? And one thing too, and I may be jumping the gun a little bit talking about it, but I know with anglers, a lot of times when we talk about management strategy, stocking is one of the strategies, and it's certainly a tool that we have. But Georgia's been doing it. They've been seeing very limited returns on stocking smallmouth. We've tried some things. I don't think we're quite where we want to be yet to say that it's going to work or not work. But it's a very low return proposition, just in general. And the problem we're going to have over here, and we've already had it, is when we have very limited. If you look at the state of North Carolina, the area that smallmouth bass are in is pretty small. It's, let's just say for the sake of argument, about a third of the state. And so as these Alabama bass expand, we got all these hybrids out there. When we go to collect brood fish to spawn, now we have to genetically test them before we can ever let them spawn in a hatchery. Because again, if we don't, now we're just exacerbating the problem of putting more hybrids back out on the landscape. So you start looking at this, and it becomes a real big can of worms. The more you go into it as to, how to handle this. And again, I go back to it. There's a solution to this, not what we have on the landscape right now, but there's a solution to it not getting any further, and that's people not moving fish.
Yeah. So I guess
and
that's the one, don't move bass. Like
don't move
that's
fish. Yeah.
yeah, don't move fish, don't move bass, right? If you're gonna take one thing away.
Yep.
As far as do you think there's like a big need for education of because obviously you guys have removed, creel or bag limits and minimum length on but is anybody actually harvesting them? And do we need an education movement? There's tournaments on Norman all the time. Do we need to
Yep.
have tournaments hey, if you bring in a spotted bass, it needs to get filleted and donated to a food bank, right? We need to manage that population, or encourage people, or maybe encourage tournament anglers, hey, that spotted bass tacos are a pretty good way to the end of the day. If you really want to see your largemouth, right? There's only so much biomass in a lake, and if there's a bunch of 10 to 14-inch spotted bass, if we don't consume some of them, the largemouth aren't going to get any bigger.
Yeah, we're definitely encouraging that. And it's funny because I know early on Chuck Murray said hi. He's our state BASS director. And he's a big proponent of doing that, of harvesting, Alabama bass. I know he's talked about that. There's Chuck. And so are we going to have population level impacts by doing that? Probably not, especially in these bigger reservoirs. But it certainly can't hurt, right? I mean, we certainly don't want people throwing them back if they're wanting to take them home or they're wanting to eat them. I mean, somebody mentioned earlier about throwing them up on the bank. I mean, not only do we not want you to do that, you really can't do that. That would be against the state fish and game laws. Yeah, wanton waste. Yep, most state agencies, that's a no-go. You're putting yourself in a legal situation there. But yeah, that's a big in terms of education. Yeah, I mean, that's obviously you're giving us a platform tonight. We're trying to spread the message. I sent you some signs today that we've started putting up at our boat ramps, and we're tailoring them to the current situation. So if we're aware there's a reservoir that doesn't have Alabama's in it yet, we've got do not stock, and then we've got some in reservoirs that we know have Alabama's. It's please harvest Alabama bass, and so trying to get that message out to folks. I know other states are doing it. We've just that's our kind of our gold standard there for places we know. And we do have some really good largemouth bass fisheries in the state that currently do not have Alabama bass, and we're sure as heck hoping that stays that way. So
yeah, so we have so shoal bass anglers are very proactive, I will say this. And so when they found out about the threat of, quote unquote spotted bass, which are, depending on the river, Alabama bass or both. Um, they have done a lot of peer pressuring of, hey, you need to keep all these fish if you catch them. And as a matter of fact, at least 2 or 3 spotted bass tournaments occur every year where it's a kill what you're catching. So they have a fish fry at the end of their tournament. One happens every year on the Flint River, and I think 2 of them happen over here on the Chattahoochee. Um, and yeah, biologically, is that going to do anything? I'm not sure, but I mean, I find it valuable that it's just putting out a message that these things are bad. you know, if you're having a catch and kill tournament then that involves bass, there's a pretty good reason for that. And I think it kind of sends the message that you don't want these things. We have them. We're not going to get rid of them anytime soon, but we're going to go out and kill a bunch of them anyway. Just because. And if nothing else, it just shows that there's some pretty good buy-in that these are not a good thing. And so I don't know about reservoirs. I don't know if has happened yet. But based on our work on the shoal bass about 10 years ago, they started doing this. There's a guide service on the Flint River that hosts one every single year, and a couple little like kayak bass clubs on the Chattahoochee that hold at least 1 or 2 every year. And they get a big turnout, and everybody has a good time, and they have the prizes and just the same old thing. But after that, everyone gets to eat fried or whatever spotted bass.
So yeah, and dovetailing into that, I've used this analogy before. You might probably heard it. The catch and release ethic came into bass fishing in the 70s into the early 80s. It was an ethic that Ray Scott started. Really, I think he's probably the major player in that. But the point I'm trying to drive home with that is that was not something legislated or mandated. That was something that anglers took upon themselves. And in this particular case, when it comes to moving fish, that same ethic or similar ethic has got to take over, because we can put all the regulations in place, and we do have them. I don't know of too many states that don't have some version of you're not allowed to stock fish without a permit in public waters. Our state has it. Everyone does. But yet and still, it only takes a couple of these fish to be moved to create a major problem. So we can do enforcement, we can do education, and those things will continue to do. But having said that, it's really on the shoulders of anglers to start a movement to stop moving these fish, because it's a southeastern problem now. Steve and I have sat around at times just talking about it, like, where would this end? I mean, what is the biological limiting factors that would prevent these fish from spreading to wherever? I mean, you mentioned California. They were put in a place that's hundreds of thousands of miles from their drainage, and they've managed to do well out there, and they're isolated there. But who's to say that the Great Lakes, some of these really good smallmouth rivers in the Northeast, who's to say up your way in Minnesota? I mean, you got some great lakes for smallmouth in Minnesota.
I mean, like, let's look at like, you got Bullard's Bar and New Maloney's, right? Like, geographically, they're probably not far from those up and coming smallmouth lakes in Idaho. So what if somebody gets the idea that they want to take a Bullard's Bar, bucket of 3, 4, 2-pounders, and all of a sudden put them in those up and coming trophy smallmouth lakes in Idaho?
Yeah.
They think it's a great idea, and we'll have big smallmouth in big spotted bass.
Right.
Well, the fact is they'll probably eradicate the smallmouth in short order. So TK says, to his knowledge, Lake McBride is the only lake in Iowa where spotted bass are prevalent. So that's pretty far north. I'm guessing the Iowa DNR didn't put them there. I could be wrong, but maybe they did. But like, now you talk about, people are asking questions in chat. How far are spotted bass showing up? I know they're in the Ohio River system, which connects to the Mississippi River system, right?
So they're native there.
And those are Kentucky's mostly right now, I think, right? And
right. Yep. So, and I think that I'm not sure where Lake McBride is in Iowa, but the part of Iowa that's in the Mississippi drainage should probably have them. That's probably about as far north as the Kentucky spotted bass native range was. And so they were in Iowa, and they're not, oddly enough, they're not much in the Missouri drainage, but neither were smallmouth, even though that's theoretically part of their native range. The Missouri is just a different river for some reason. There's a lot of things that occur in the Mississippi that don't occur in the Missouri. Yeah, spotted bass kind of are found mostly from like the lower Midwest down into the central South, the bottom half of the Mississippi drainage, if you will. Yeah, so see that river there, that's probably in the range.
So this is Mississippi right here.
This is the Mississippi that forms that eastern border. So they could be native there. They also could have gotten moved from one to the other, and they could have been stocked there possibly. Although I don't know if Iowa would have bothered to stock spotted bass in one of its lakes, because they just, that's
like geographically, right? Like this is not a big haul. This is only 4 hours from Chicago, probably, where you have potential,
right. Yeah, I mean,
well, if they're spotted bass, and this is something that needs to be kind of driven home, is Steve talked about the lake that we worked on, where we had a really substantial spotted bass population, kind of a minimal smallmouth population, but they were native there, and we didn't have any issues with them. I mean, I don't remember seeing anything that looked like a hybrid, and certainly not more than a couple if there were. So when they've evolved together, there's that reproductive barrier, and because these fish haven't evolved together, they're being put together. There doesn't seem to be that barrier, and so
I guess the question is,
go ahead.
Do we feel that like Kentucky spotted bass and the Alabama bass, if a spotted bass can live this far north, do we think an Alabama bass can live that far north, or we think they're that close, or we don't know how far Alabama north? Can we make some conclusions that if a spotted bass can live in Iowa, that a Alabama bass could probably thrive in Iowa if it got put there?
I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, and that's the problem, right? And one thing
don't want to find out, right?
No,
that's the purpose of this.
well, so there's two ways of finding this out, and real quick, what Steve and I have kind of noticed too is if you have Kentucky's native and you put Alabama's in, they're going to work on them as hard or harder than they're going to work on the smallmouth bass. So it's kind of like the flathead catfish in my area. A lot of problems today, they're not native. A lot of people think about them reducing redbreast sunfish, but really when you go back to the history of it, they got rid of the native bullhead catfishes first. They loved them first, and then they're kind of a long afterthought at this point. But there's two ways to figure that out, really. One is to do some lab experiments where you put these fish in tanks and you alter the temperatures and whatever variables you want to play around with to see what happens, and you can get some reasonable inferences from that. And the other is to stock them someplace and see what happens. And unfortunately, most of the time that's irreversible. So we would not want to do that.
Right. So we know they live in Northern California, which is, it's not a super harsh climate temperature wise. I mean, it does get chilly. I mean, they do have winter, but not winter like I have, right?
No.
But I think there's reason to believe
drive out on the lake winter.
If Alabama bass got into the Great Lakes, there's reasonable belief that they could survive and thrive and compete.
Yeah, I would say yes as of right now. That's what I would say. One of the weird. So this is one of the things that you pull back the this is like the Wizard of Oz, where we pull back the curtain and see what Oz is really like. So here's the sad truth of black bass biology. Okay, so when this actually goes back to the project that Lawrence was working on for his master's degree, when we got done with that, so we'd worked on spotted bass, the Kentucky spotted bass. So when we got done with that, he had graduated and he'd moved back to North Carolina and started his job already. But I had to make the final report, so I was starting to, start trying to put our results in context to what other people have found, what you typically do, right? So spotted bass are found over almost a third of the country, Kentucky's roughly. I mean, that's their range. They're not uncommon. A lot of people live where spotted bass are. There was almost no work ever done on spotted bass. There was nothing to compare our results to because no one ever even bothered to even age the fish, let alone anything else. And I was like, boy, that's really weird, you know. And then I went back to working on largemouth bass, and I did that for my PhD, and did a few other things. And then all of a sudden, I start working on shoal bass. And boy, if I thought nobody knew anything about spots, no one knew anything about shoal bass or all these red-eye bass or Swanee bass or Guadalupe bass. We know a lot about them now because they almost went extinct. So Texas spent a lot of money trying to figure out what's going on with them. But we have a lot of preconceived notions about black bass as a group that, if you really dig into it and look, are almost all based on largemouth bass, as if that is the gold standard and everything will act like largemouth bass. Well, we know already that's not true, you know, and that's easy to say, well, that's not true. But then the next question is, well, then what do these individual species do? What kind of habitats do they need? Where do they thrive? What are their limits? And until very recently, that was an academic question that was interesting, but we would never, no one wants to fund that kind of stuff, and we just don't do it. And now we have this fish marching up the eastern seaboard, destroying everything in its path, essentially. And the question, of course, is how far north can they go? And the answer really is we have no idea, because we have no clue what the thermal tolerances are of this animal, just like we don't know it for Kentucky bass or any of the other 15 species of black bass not named largemouth or smallmouth. And so we've gotten caught in the fact that we did all this work on largemouth, little less, but still a lot of work on smallmouth bass. We understand those two species rather well, and we figured, okay, we know everything there is to know about black bass, and now we realize we don't. And now we have a real world problem that needs answers to those questions that we don't have them. And I tell people all the time, I don't know much about Bullard's Bar, but the fact that they're eating trout doesn't exactly fill me with confidence that they're going to not like cold water. So right. I'm not sure.
And if you think they are readily intermingling with smallmouth, and we know smallmouth thrive, right? So there is some connect the dots here. They probably would be just fine. So let's not find out.
Yeah. That's the truth is that, they have their sights set. And again, I act like they're the ones moving themselves. They're not. But you look at the directions they're moving right now. There are some world-class smallmouth bass fisheries distressingly close to where they're found right now.
Like the New River and right.
Well, they're in the New already. So they're in the New River. They're in.
So the New is like a ticking time bomb of smallmouth being not a great fishery.
Yeah, I mean, so the Susquehanna is not far away from where they are. It's about a 200-mile drive tops. And if they get in the Susquehanna, then you have the Juniata and a couple other western Pennsylvania rivers that are right there. And that's a very short drive from the Susquehanna to Lake Erie. And the guy that we were on the podcast for, Joey, I think is
Jody
White. Jody. He lives on Champlain. Well, I mean, that's another place I'd be worried about, like the whole Northeast. Where will it end? Well, we don't know where it's going to end. But if I was sitting on world-class smallmouth bass fisheries right now, I'd be worried, no matter where the heck I was, because yes, it does run.
It does.
We were talking. I guess we were talking about this on the phone earlier, that I'm still waiting for the first time that Alabama bass show up somewhere and bad things don't happen. I mean, there is nothing. I mean, they even if they have a numerically dominant fishery like they do in Norman, where everyone's catching the heck out of them. I'm not saying that's a good outcome, because the largemouth bass are gone. There are no largemouth bass essentially left there, and so somebody always loses. And the smallmouth bass so far, if they've been in there any length of time, bad things are happening. I mean, Lawrence can tell you that a lot of the Western North Carolina reservoirs are, again, every year they go, there's fewer of them. I mean, it's pretty clear that the Western North Carolina reservoirs are heading towards North Georgia land, which means there'll be no smallmouth bass in those reservoirs in another 10 years. So it's a scary thing. It is. And it's even more scary because the professionals, if that's what you want to call us, the biologists who are supposed to know some of this stuff, we don't, because no one's ever studied these fish in any meaningful way ever. We've just taken them for granted. And I mean, we could tell you how fast they grow. We know a little bit about their recruitment dynamics in reservoirs as far as like native range anyway. But simple things like how cold can they tolerate temperatures, still don't know. We don't even know like where do they really spawn, what kind of habitats they spawn in. We think that they probably spawn deeper. We think that they use rocks and stuff like that. In other words, we think that they spawn in a lot of the same places that smallmouth bass spawn in reservoirs. Anyway,
this makes sense because that's how they would hybridize, because they're trying to spawn in the same places.
And the more we study all these black bass species, the more we realize that ironically, the oddball in the whole group is actually largemouth bass. They're the ones that spawn in backwaters or in sandy areas and build these big nests and defend them and all that kind of stuff. An awful lot of these other fish, red eyes, shoal bass, probably Alabama bass, probably spotted bass, they make very indistinguishable nests in any kind of habitat. Usually, though, more main lake kind of rocky, steep, like not a gentle slope. Like, if it's a rock bluff and there's a few shelves that they can spawn on, they probably spawn on those, because shoal bass certainly do that in the river. You can't even see their nests. You see them defend a rock. Like, what the heck are they doing there? Well, there's a nest on that rock. I mean, so largemouths are actually they're the weirdo of the group, if you will. And that's why I think we rarely see largemouths hybridize with anything else, because they are absolutely separate. But you name the other fish, smallmouth bass, spotted bass, Alabama bass, shoal bass, red-eye bass, they all, if they get moved on top of each other, they all hybridize. You can move largemouth bass all over Hell's Half Acre and they don't spawn with anything other than Florida bass, which is probably still a largemouth bass, no matter what.
Which is, I think, answers Ed's question. Northeast, where I live, North Midwest, we don't really have spots. We have smallmouth and largemouth, and they just don't occupy largely the same habitats when they spawn.
Right.
If we had versions of spotted bass, we would start to see hybridization pretty quick, most likely.
That would be my guess. Smallmouth and largemouth have a long history, and the Northeast, that person that just made that comment, is a great place. And so is the upper Midwest, Wisconsin and Minnesota. You have a lot of lakes. I've fished some lakes in Northeast Minnesota that have both, and they hang out together and they're perfectly fine. They're perfectly happy. They probably subdivide the habitat really nicely, in those northern natural lakes that, this better than I do, I'm sure. Largemouth like those weedy areas and little deeper weed lines and stuff like that. And the smallmouth are a little more on the rocky, open shorelines, and some in the weeds, but not usually. They're bigger fish, not like the little guys. And so they just kind of separate.
They definitely tend to coexist in the summer and fall, but they don't tend to coexist in the spring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so they seem to figure everything out that way. But it looks like if you think about an old concept that I don't think really is used as much anymore. If you think about what they used to call an ecological niche, the size of an area, or the tolerance, like, so you have like largemouth being like that and smallmouth being like that, and the spotted bass being more like this, where they can be over here, they can be over there, and they're perfectly happy. And that's kind of how I thought of that. I think of them, and Alabama bass the same way. I mean, they seem to be able to figure things out in a wide variety of places, and they probably aren't doing the same thing in order to do that. And largemouth bass, we really do know kind of what they need to reproduce. They need stable water levels. They need these nice protected areas. Shallow, relatively shallow sloping areas with some firm substrate, preferably a little bit of cover near, but not too much, where they have too many nest predators there, but I think spots and our Alabama bass can spawn in a lot of different places. So I think that's kind of what we see here is that these fish are really, really adaptable. There's a few things we think they don't like: really turbid water, dense weeds, and I would say really small things. Like I've heard of people in Mississippi. I don't know why Mississippi, but a couple of people have reached out to me years ago and mentioned about, that they have fished farm ponds that have, spotted bass or Alabama bass or whatever they are. But I would say my experience in Alabama is that's really rare. Like they just, you could throw some in there and they'll live, but they don't perpetuate for whatever reason. They're not a pond fish for the most part.
I think
really smallmouth bass aren't either, unless you have exactly the right kind of pond. I remember when I was in South Dakota State, Dave Willis, the big name fish management professor, who's sadly deceased now. He had one pond outside of Brookings that had smallmouth bass in it, and it was an old quarry, tiny little old quarry thing. It was like a cast long or a cast wide and like 5 casts long, but it was like 20 feet deep. It like went straight down, and they didn't even have largemouths in there. It was just them, But that's obviously a weird pond. I mean, if you think about your typical pond, it's usually weedy and soft bottom and all that. Smallmouth aren't too happy in there either, and I don't think the spots are either. That's like the one thing they don't seem to like, but that doesn't help you.
But they do. And like somebody asked about flow earlier, and the Alabama bass seem to do just fine in heavy current, right?
Right. So, one thing to keep in mind when you start talking about the whole south half of the country, below the glacier line, if you will, is there are no natural lakes down here. And so all the bass are actually originally river fish that make some at least make the adjustment when we impound them and turn them into a lake. Largemouth bass have no problem with that. Our smallmouth bass don't have a problem with that. Our spotted bass, our Alabama bass don't. Once you get to the other ones, the red eyes, the shoal bass, they disappear when you impound them. They can't handle that. So that's not a problem at all, because they are river fish. They just happen to transition the reservoirs when we dam them up.
Yeah, we do have one drainage that has them in it now that I mean, it flows into the sound. But honestly, it gets really turbid below where they're at. So I almost think the turbidity is probably going to hold them back more than the salinity influence will. I've not worked much in the northeast part of our state, where we do have a lot of coastal rivers that flow into sounds. And I kind of thought, well, they probably won't get in there because there's salinity. And then my fisheries chief, who did work out there, said, well, the salinity in those rivers is not as high as you think for a good portion of them. And so there's that worry. Like Steve said, turbidity is something we've seen, is a limiting factor. And, our good bass lakes here that are around Raleigh, the 3 that, get a lot of press that MLF fished a couple of years ago, they're pretty turbid. Most of them are. And so we're hoping that even if someone were to put them in there, that they're not going to take over. Just a couple other points I want to bring out is, talking about the range of these fish now, or what it, Alabama bass, what it could be. I mean, I haven't measured it. I haven't taken a protractor or whatever and measured it, but I would say that, their introduced range is getting pretty close, if not larger, to their native range right now. So that's pretty scary that, you've got a fish that has a fairly small native range, and now you've got this larger introduced range of it. Second thing is, I know we've had some comments from Iowa and folks talking about Pennsylvania. And so one of the things we've done, and Steve kind of alluded to it earlier, is the 4 or 5 states that have issues right now. We've gotten together a group of biologists, and we talk 2 to 3 times a year. Sometimes it's a conference call, sometimes it's just email. But about a year ago, we decided, there's some states out there that state agency biologists that are not in our management group, which is the Southeast, that need to know about this because they're probably not even aware of it. I mean, if the anglers aren't, we take for granted sometimes that state agencies know what, everything that's going on 2 states over. That's not the case. So we've brought in Iowa, we've brought in Indiana, Illinois, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. I don't know if we've reached out to anybody in PA yet, but they're probably, we need to get somebody on the horn for that. I know Kentucky, the state of Kentucky, has just started the genetics testing program. They're hoping they don't see any Alabama bass, but they're waiting for their results to get back so that they can, because they do have spotted bass. I mean, Kentucky, right? So, and as Steve said, that's kind of where they creep in and you don't see them, is because they are so close together. I mean, if you don't have spotted bass and you just have smallmouth, then you start seeing them in those mean mouths. You will see the visual signs of them. So we're trying to rope other states in. We talked to Missouri, we've talked to Arkansas. They're in the group. We got some folks from Arkansas, and so I'm hoping we don't have to pull in the Michigans, the Minnesotas, the Ohio's, but I know we're having a joint meeting with some folks early next year from up that way, out of that sort of management unit as our professional society is, and I'm hoping that they see how serious this is. And again, it's education and it's angler will. I mean, and one other point on angler will, and I brought this up before too, is and you talked a little bit about in the beginning about tell us who you are to build some credibility. I would tell you that our credibility only goes so far as people want to let it. And not surprisingly, and I don't have a problem with this, a lot of anglers look towards the pro anglers for advice and information. You talk about Gerald Swindle coming on, talk about buzz baits. Well, I would love it if an angler would come on and talk about how bad Alabama bass are and how you don't want them in your state. And I'm hoping that as this goes on and we talk to the pro anglers, and we've done a little bit of that we can get somebody to pick up that mantle a little bit and run with it. It's something I'd like to see.
Yeah. And I think even like getting a seat at the table, right? Like the Bass Nation just had their national championship at Hartwell, and
Mm-hmm.
all the state officers and conservation directors and youth directors get together. So like that'd be a
Yep.
great place to start as well. It's like, hey, you guys are on the front lines. You can reach, how many tens of thousands of club tournament anglers. So I think there's a lot of, that's part of the reason I know like this is probably not the most interesting. I mean, some people are probably interested in this, but like it's important, right? We need to spread the word so that people understand that this is not and like the Coosa River is not far from the Alabama River in places in Alabama, right? And so if they get in the Alabama River, then all of a sudden they're from Alabama to Tennessee to Kentucky, like in a heartbeat, right? And then all of a sudden so that it doesn't take much in the right watershed to go a long ways. So
Well, and we've seen them here. I plotted it out. I mean, they're in, except for those northeast coastal rivers that I talked about, they're in about every river drainage we have in the state at some place in the drainage now. And that's a 20-year time cycle. That's not 40 or 50 years. And so, I mean, are they all throughout the drainages? No, there's still plenty of places that they're not. There's places that they probably won't ever be just due to the way they're set up. But the fact that we've got them, this is the place that I didn't go in my mind when they got into Norman. I didn't think that people would start moving them like they have. But every time you get a new spot and it's farther away from the last spot, now you've got a jump off point for the next spot, for the next place, for people to move them. And it's like the gift that keeps on giving, but not in a good way. And I mean, I remember as a kid going fishing at Jordan Lake outside of Raleigh with my neighbor. We had a lake in my neighborhood and bringing home crappie and throwing them in the lake because we didn't want to clean them. And that's pretty harmless. I mean, what I thought was harmless. And I got to be a fisheries biologist and I realized how dumb that was. There's probably a lot of other things I realized I didn't do that were very smart back then. But in that particular case, it was one small lake in my neighborhood. Doing that even innocently. I'm not saying everyone has bad intentions for doing it, but there's huge problems, and they're problems we can't get away from. We don't have any technology. I've had people ask me before, well, is there some kind of genetic, you know, with all the genetic technology and genetic mutations and, you know, genetic engineering that's out there, is there some? And when you talk to our geneticists, we have a geneticist on staff here who's a PhD, and she's extremely smart and way more knowledgeable about genetics than I am. She starts running things down, and for every possibility that she can come up with that maybe there's something down the road, she'll say, but this is the problem with that. And you start making these trade-offs that are just crazy, you know, and it's not feasible. So the simple solution is just, you know, don't get them in your lake in the first place.
Yeah,
So, and it
absolutely.
sounds easy, but that's where it is.
But I think people get tempted, right? Because like you have a fishery that's declining, maybe it's getting
Mm-hmm.
older, it's starting to lose habitat, it's harder to catch largemouth, right? Or the right the catch rates are going down. It's going through a natural potential
Mm-hmm.
cycle of up and down,
Mm-hmm.
right? And all of a sudden like, well,
Right.
over in that lake, I can go and catch 30, 40 spotted bass every time I go out, and that's a ton of fun, right? And then all of a sudden they're
Mm-hmm.
like, well, I'll just put some spotted bass in here, and then we'll catch bass all the time.
And I
And
think you're
that's
right.
the
I think
danger.
that's a lot. I think that's a lot of it. I mean, certainly at Norman, it was frustration for years. There were multiple fisheries out there that weren't doing well. I mean, I won't talk about the striped bass fishery, but that was another one out there that, you know, some people spent their whole careers trying to fix and didn't get fixed. I think we're in a good spot now there, but again, it's like there's this perception of what the lake should be, and it's not. And when you start trying to compare lakes, it's not an apples to apples comparison. And so, you know, you know, it's there's a lot of layers to it. There really are.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
and to be honest, right, like there's probably a risk to the pure dama that they get in the watersheds where they start diluting, and then somehow they come back to the native, and then you could have a reverse potentially, right, where we actually lose the
yeah,
Alabama bass
so
in its good distribution where it thrives, right?
right. If, for instance, if people tried to start throwing smallmouth bass into the Mobile Basin, where they're not native, then theoretically the same thing could happen in reverse. Um, it's really kind of odd because it's usually, regardless of which one it is, it's the one that gets moved that is the problem. You know,
Mm,
so Alabama bass in and of themselves, they're perfectly fine in the Mobile Basin. They tend to be the most numerically dominant bass in most of those reservoirs and in those rivers. Um, and um, and the largemouth make their way kind of around where they are, but they don't eliminate them. I mean, Lake Martin is the closest reservoir to here. It's on the Tallapoosa River. It's a big one. It's 46,000 acres, I think. It's been there for. It's coming up on its centennial. I think it was impounded in 26, so it's been there a really long time.
sure.
People catch largemouth bass in tournaments there all the time. Yes, you usually are going to win with 5 Alabama bass, but they're not gone, you know. So it's more like, I don't know that anybody would have necessarily expected Alabama bass to become the aggressor that they are when you look at them in their native range. But you move them outside of their native range, and they become an absolute monster. Um, and I mean, we have a lot of examples of that happening. Smallmouth bass were the one that was stocked into the hill country area of Texas by the state in the 70s to create a an additional fishery, and basically came close to wiping out Guadalupe bass through hybridization. So it's not just one fish that does it.
Yeah.
The most extreme example, which is insane, but again, back to where we were in Tennessee, just north of Cookeville, where the university is, there's several small streams up there that, for whatever reason, the state of Tennessee decided in the 60s that they just needed to put red-eye bass in these streams. So again, red-eye bass are a fish that is very pretty, but never gets more than 10 or maybe 12 inches. All these streams have had great smallmouth bass fisheries in them. They put them in there, and they immediately started hybridizing with all the smallmouth bass. Even a 10-inch fish, I mean, they became the problem. Even though down here, they're getting victimized by Alabama bass getting stocked on top of them in Georgia, not here because they're both native here. But so it just goes to show that it really doesn't matter what the fish is, other than a largemouth bass, which seems to leave everybody alone for whatever reason. But it's not just some magic that Alabama bass are that are always the problem. They're only a problem when they get moved. Just like smallmouth bass can be a problem if they get moved, or apparently red-eye bass can be a problem if they get moved. So it's moving bass is the biggest problem, and it's one of those things where we know bad things are going to happen, but we don't know A, what, and we don't know B, how bad. So you're literally playing Russian roulette with your lake or river if you're putting bass in there, because not only do you not know what's going on or going to happen, neither do we. And like Lawrence says, it's really a bad thing to find out later that it was a really terrible idea, because there's no going back.
Absolutely. I think we've covered this. So if you guys are up for it, you can open it up for a few more, like just more general bass fishing fisheries questions, things like that. I'm going to play a quick little spot from a channel partner here, and then we'll come back in 60 seconds and open it up for some other questions.
Yep.
Are you ready to reel in your next home purchase or refinance? Supreme Lending's Dream Team can help guide you through the entire mortgage process, from pre-qualification to closing. We have a wide variety of home loan programs in our tackle box, including down payment assistance and first-time homebuyer options. You can ask HellaBass. He trusted us to help finance his home. Contact the Dream Team today by searching Supreme Lending Dream Team, or click the link below in the description, or scan the QR code on your screen.
I think you're muted, Rich.
Yeah, you must be.
We're back. Sorry. Yeah. So anybody that's looking for a new lake place or a new place with a bigger garage to store their toys, they can check out the guys from the Dream Team. We're also bass fishermen. So there we go. Yeah. So let's open it up. Let me look through the starred questions here. Yeah. There's a comment from Chuck saying that he's seen it firsthand down in his area.
Yep.
I
I
believe
know
the
what he's
Lanier.
talking about.
Yeah, I think the Lanier spots are Alabama's, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
They are. Yep. And they were put in there in the 70s. So they've been in there a long time. And honestly, Lake Lanier is probably almost more commonly cited by people who want them in their lake than even the Coosa River reservoirs are. Because it is a tremendous fishery. Now, it did completely eliminate the existing largemouth bass fishery that's there. But yeah, they are Alabama spotted bass.
So Aaron's from Minnesota. He's saying, should we put gobies in Mille Lacs? Would it become a mini St. Lawrence?
Probably not. So gobies are an interesting thing. I don't know that much about them because I'm not a Great Lakes biologist, although we do have some friends that are, including one that used to be our classmate at Tennessee Tech. So in this case, putting gobies in the Great Lakes didn't negatively affect bass, as far as we know, but it negatively affected a lot of other species of fish that were found in those lakes. I mean, it wiped out an awful lot of benthic native fish that were there filling that niche. And so, I don't think it's ever a good idea to move a fish, even a prey fish, somewhere just to benefit fishing when you're eliminating other native fish.
Yeah, I'll say this. One thing that, where we do have some control. So in reservoirs, particularly in the Southeast, but all over the United States, if we stock striped bass in the reservoirs, in general, they can't reproduce. There's a few, examples out there of places they can. So as management agency, if we deem a lake no longer a good striped bass fishery, and we've had a couple of those here that we used to stock and we just never saw stripers, we can stop stocking, and in about 5 to 10 years, those fish are gone. They're not there anymore. But that's not. There are very few examples of that, and so there's, years ago they came out with some guidelines about what to stock, how to stock, when to stock. Excuse me, but in general, it's just, there's very limited cases where it's worth doing and worth trying, because the negative consequences, if they occur, are so much. They're so dramatic and they're so long lasting that, excuse me, that I wouldn't advise it. I've never been on Mille Lacs. I know where it is, but no, I wouldn't advise it any more than I would advise putting them in a lake down in my state. So,
yeah, I think it's important for everyone to remember that these are public resources, and so to just decide that you or a group or a couple of you or whatever are going to unilaterally alter a public resource for what you consider to be your own benefit or your own group's benefit is just kind of, I don't know, sketchy. You could be affecting somebody else. And I've made this argument about the Alabama bass thing. Like, oh yeah, I agree. Heck, I fish on one of the reservoirs in the Savannah Basin. It's wonderful. It's fun as heck. You're catching the snot out of them. However, it eliminated something else, like the largemouth bass. If you're a guy who likes to fish for trophy largemouth bass or big largemouth bass, let's just say big. Well, you just got disenfranchised by somebody who wanted to spot it, Alabama bass in the lake. And so it just comes down to just a sense of what's right. Is it okay to step on somebody else's pastime because you want to enhance yours? I don't think so.
Yeah. So this is interesting. They said they fished a tourney at Sturgeon Bay, right, which is on Lake Michigan, Wisconsin, Green Bay area.
mm-hmm.
They didn't want anglers to go past a certain distance not to mix smallmouth strains within the lake. Does that make sense to you guys?
I've never heard of that, but it sounds like if they were told that, at least you hope that they were told that because there was some biological reason, that they had some data already that suggested that there were subspecies or strains in the lake. But I've never heard of that up there. Not to say that it doesn't happen. I just never heard of it.
Yeah, I don't know. It would be subspecies. I do know that there's some genetic differences, but is that, I don't know. I have to assume, like Lawrence said, you have to assume that somebody had data to say that there was differences, and they seem like they must feel like that's worth preserving. I know that the stuff I'm thinking of is more Lake Superior, but still there's some work there that shows that there's smallmouth bass that stay in the lake and reproduce there, and there's another group of smallmouth bass that actually run up tributary rivers and spawn there, and they are able to distinguish between them using either genetics or otolith.
Well, that would potentially make sense because, right, the tournaments take out of Sturgeon Bay, so they're in more of a bay with connected rivers, and they're probably keeping them from running out into the lake and maybe truly catching what would be a more pelagic fish, right? That
like,
wouldn't
like
normally
walleyes,
come into the
there's
bay.
rivers. Yeah, there's river spawning walleyes, lake spawning walleyes, and natural system.
And there are walleye. They're not subspecies, but genetically walleyes in some of those lakes. The deep water walleyes, I think they call them the blue pike or something like that. I think that's, again, Lake Superior. Lake Superior is such a weird lake compared to most of those other Great Lakes. It's the depth and the coldness of it. But yeah, I would have to assume that somebody, I would hope anyway, that somebody who knew what they were doing had a good reason to tell them that, because that's otherwise kind of a pain in the butt. But so the multiple species or subspecies of smallmouth bass is pretty easy to answer. As of right now, there's a lot of people who love splitting things into new species. So this may not be true in 10 years. But as of right now, there are 3 subspecies / species of smallmouth bass. You have the one that is over most of the range. It's the one that we have in the Tennessee River Basin in Alabama. It's the same one you have in Minnesota. It's the one that would be up in the Great Lakes. If you think of it as a subspecies, you would call it the northern smallmouth bass. And then you have the two really what we call range restricted species, the Neosho smallmouth bass, which is found in only part of the Ozarks. A colleague here, Shannon Brewer, works on those fish. She knows way better than I do the geography about what rivers they are, but they are genetically distinct. They are probably a species because one of the things that she found out in her work on those fish is they're a river only fish. So when they impounded those rivers, they disappeared, just like our river fish over here, the shoal bass and the red eyes. That Oklahoma actually stocked Tennessee strain, which is northern, in those reservoirs to recreate the fisheries because they disappeared before they realized that was a bad idea. They do not do that any longer. But one of the coolest things that she found in her research was, it's a drought, it's an arid environment. So sometimes they have these, periods where the reservoir goes down 25 feet for months and then all of a sudden fills back up. And she was doing a radio tracking study in one of those streams that flowed into there. When the reservoir went down, they moved down into what used to be the reservoir and now was a stream. And then when it came back up, they went right back up into the river. So they are really a river fish. I don't think there's any doubt that they're actually a separate species. And the other one is the Ouachita smallmouth bass. That's found more in extreme northwest Arkansas in the Ouachita drainage. That is the one we know the least about. And again, heavily hybridized with northern smallmouth bass that were stocked in some of the reservoirs before anyone realized that there was any difference. This would have been decades and decades ago. So that's kind of where we are currently with smallmouth bass. It's kind of weird. There's these right on the southwestern edge of the range of the whole critter. There's these two right next to each other. The Ouachita and the Ozarks are almost adjacent. And then the entire rest of all of that is, as of right now, is considered one species or one subspecies.
Which is interesting because I think a lot of people look at the bass that come out of Ontario, Michigan, Champlain, St. Lawrence. They look one way, and then you look at a Tennessee River smallmouth, and at a glance, you would assume they are not the same species. But so far, genetically and scientifically, they have not been delineated from each other.
Correct.
Lauren's talking about a lake just north of Minneapolis, and I have heard, I've caught smallmouth. I've actually seen smallmouth attempting to spawn. I don't know if they're successful or not, but they definitely get caught out of there. But I definitely have heard and may or may not know people that have attempted to either move them from Mille Lacs or from the Mississippi River, which is not far away.
Right.
But so far, I don't think that has been a successful transplant. Let's see here. Dustin says the DNR in Illinois has tried to create many smallmouth populations in some of their lakes. Doesn't seem to be successful. Is that common from what you guys know, where they try to create smallmouth fisheries and smallmouth don't take off even where biologists think they will?
I would tell you that it's a black bass thing in a lot of cases. I mean, if there's existing populations or, to try to do enhancement or I've never tried to stock a black bass into a place where they weren't before, but I definitely, and we're doing some of it now here, we go a whole nother road, which probably would take us longer than we got on the podcast to talk about F1 bass. We might need to come back another day and do that. But, supplemental stocking a black bass in the systems is typically it's a low return proposition. There are cases where it works. We used to try to do that in rivers here after hurricanes. And what we finally figured out is that there was a short-term burst with those stocked fish, but natural reproduction was just so much more effective. And over the long haul, you were going to get more bang for your buck by waiting a couple of years and letting those populations return on their own than you were going to be just supplementally stocked to try to restart them. It was good in theory, but in practice, it didn't really yield many results. So the fact that they were stocking something and it didn't work, that happened years and years ago in fisheries management all across the United States. But once the hatchery technology got to a point where we could culture fish or we could transport fish, management agency said, well, hey, let's try this here, see if it works. And in a lot of cases, I mean, we've got a couple of lakes in North Carolina where they stock northern pike. And you look at it and you're like, why would they do that? Well, it was because they could. And as biologists today, we kind of think that's silly, but that's where the science was back in the 40s and 50s. And so, nowadays we wouldn't even entertain something. Yeah, or lack thereof. Yeah, we wouldn't entertain something like that. So
I remember there's records of Chinook salmon being stocked into Center Hill Reservoir by Tennessee Wildlife Research Agency. Needless to say, that didn't go well for them. But to answer that question, just to add any answer to that question, if they put them in there and they didn't take, clearly the habitat wasn't there to support it. Because I mean, usually if you're introducing a new fish there, it's going to probably work if there's something there for them. Trying to bolster an existing population with stocking is a rare. I mean, I think a lot of people think that works. It almost never does it. I mean, unless the fish are not reproducing on their own, well, that's a different story. But assuming that the population that you're stocking into is at an equilibrium population, if you try to throw a bunch of fish on top of them, they don't make it, because there's a reason why there's that many fish in there probably. And unless it's a recruitment problem, then it doesn't work. After Lawrence was done and moved on to North Carolina, the last thing I did was a statewide crappie project. The state of Tennessee does stock crappie. And at the end of the day, after looking at a variety of reservoirs, big surprise, the places where the stocking works is the places where the fish have really poor recruitment or really, really, really boom and bust recruitment. And the better the natural recruitment was, the worse and worse the stocking looked, And so usually if the fish can do it on their own, the stocking doesn't do anything, because like Lawrence said, natural reproduction far exceeds what we can put in there with a hatchery truck.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure the smallmouth bass in California are the Great Lakes Tennessee River variety.
The garden variety.
Yeah.
And I think this is kind of what I hinted at, right? That I think they see that like river smallies and lake smallies tend to look different, but I would assume that's more of an evolution thing. They're just evolving to adapt. It's maybe not adaptation to their environment. Maybe is a better way to say it.
That would be my guess. Yeah. Heck, you think about just think of largemouth bass. So in lakes, something as simple as fish in a lake that have limited food supplies or a different kind of food supply they're longer and usually a little thinner than the fish that are from another lake with a really good food supply, where they're usually shorter and fatter. And it's just because that's just the way their environment, adapts. They adapt to their environment. And so, I would say the river, my experience generally for smallmouth bass, I know there's some exceptions to this, but, river smallmouth bass tend to be a lot more torpedo shaped than the ones you catch out of reservoirs, and certainly in lakes up where you are, where they're little footballs. And I think that just makes sense, because you have that drag on you. You don't necessarily want to be a football. It's better for you.
Right. And I think like a river smallmouth, you have I just think about it naturally, right? Like, so if you have a population that spawns, there's going to be a range of tail sizes, right? And a fatter, thicker, wider tail is going to serve you better in a river. And so you're going to have a little better chance to survive. Mm-hmm. And your buddies that have thick, wider tails, right? So then there's a better chance that you guys will spawn. And then that over time will create, right, a slightly different looking smallmouth. Whereas like on Erie or a place with a lot of rocks and you're feeding on crayfish, if you've got a point of your head and you're better adept at getting crayfish out of rocks, you're going to thrive and you're going to spawn with other fish that are share that skill set or unique, right? So like that,
Yeah.
At a high level, I think that's why you're seeing that across, I mean, Mille Lacs fish look completely different than Mississippi River fish, and they're almost same part of the same watershed,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
they thrive differently and adapt differently.
Seen some questions about silting and reservoirs,
Yeah.
and yeah. So here's the short answer to that. I mean, every reservoir out there is nothing more than a silt trap, and and theoretically, without dredging, and we won't open that story, but at some point in the geological history of the Earth, if the dam's still there and there's enough sediment brought in, I mean, the whole thing will fill in. And I've seen at least one reservoir that I used to cover, which is High Rock Lake. I've seen the volume of that lake, even in the 20 years I've been here, portions of it reduced due to sedimentation. It's got a lot of urbanization and some agriculture above it. And it's got a good catchment area at the top end of the reservoir, just the way the reservoir is shaped. And there's a creek arm up there that's, at some point in the next 10 years, unless they dredge it, you're going to have an oxbow situation, similar to what you have in rivers where, the channel moves and just due to natural occurrences, and you get these oxbows formed. And so, but yeah, I mean, they're silt traps. And some, again, depending on the watershed and the depth of the lake and all that kind of stuff, you can see impacts to that. So
Yeah, the geology really dictates, or land use, but there's also a geological, a broader scale thing. For instance, Kansas is one that I can tell you for sure. They have seen absurd loss of reservoir volumes, just because their soil is more mobile than ours, and it could
Nebraska as well.
Yeah, I mean, some of those reservoirs have experienced, just over the sake of my career, like a 60% decline in their reservoir volume. That for us over here in the Southeast would take a century. I mean, we just don't have, for the most part, that kind of sediment mobilized because our soils are different. I mean, we have a lot of clay that doesn't move as much,
Yeah.
And so that plays into it as well. But they all do trap sediment on some level. The hat trick of death.
Well, we just actually got, we don't have Asian carp, but we just actually got zebra mussels confirmed in a quarry that's adjacent to Lake Norman. So we would have close to 2 of the 3 if they got in the lake, and I'm hoping we can get them out of the quarry, the zebra mussels, before they get in the lake. So yeah.
Hopefully we don't find out how Asian carp and Alabama bass, fare together.
Yeah, we're going to have Asian carp in the state before too. Well, we technically have them in the Tennessee drainage, but that's just a small sliver of the state. But at some point, they're going to be in the Mobile Basin, and God only knows what that's going to be like. I could see a scenario where zebra mussels can interact with the likelihood of Alabama bass doing well, because if they get in a eutrophic reservoir, the one thing I don't know much about zebra mussels because I have not worked where they're a problem. But one thing I know they do is they're really good at clearing up the water. And so you could take a green lake that might not be that attractive to Alabama bass and turn it into a perfect Alabama bass lake. And then, so in a way, there would be a synergistic effect. But that again would be just a random thing. But yeah, none of those are good news.
There are not many lakes up by me that don't have zebra mussels now, it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of real close to the Great Lakes where they all started. So,
Yeah, for sure.
It feels like it has to be a lot more than just boats, though. I think there has to be some other, like birds and other things that are spreading it.
Sure.
I think
It's got to. I mean, if there's a lot of them, if birds are taking dips in those places that just have a ton of them, it's hard. It's going to be certain times of the year. It's going to be hard for them not to carry, villagers with them and stuff like that, I would guess.
See, I had a couple of questions here. So what do you, I mean, this, we talked a lot about education of the not spreading bass, right? Not doing bucket biology, not moving fish, right? And that we need to raise the education on that. I also, to me, and I want your guys' thoughts on this, I think as much as what Ray Scott did with don't kill your catch and catch and release, I think we kind of need to start talking about selective harvests, right? Like what are your guys' thoughts on, like, I think there's two almost catch and release to a fault in some areas in some fisheries.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, so when we look at, and Steve can comment on this because he's got a lot of experience with this too. But when we look at our bass populations now, we look at putting regulations on our largemouth. I say bass for us in North Carolina. It's at least where I'm at. It's mostly all largemouth. Really the only impact outside of natural mortality, any kind of fishing mortality, is delayed release from tournaments. And that varies. Some tournaments do a great job of holding fish and releasing them. Other ones don't. And so, you go to the ramp on a Monday morning, particularly in the summertime, and you may see some dead bass. But, having said that, there's not a lot of harvest out there. And in our reservoirs here, the bigger reservoirs, there's only really a few maybe that I could say, well, they probably need some harvest, that maybe that would help them. Where we see that a lot is in our mid-sized to smaller reservoirs that are, what we call our municipal impoundments, where we do get stunted largemouth populations, and it would really help for them to take some fish out. And you're right. I mean, I think we're at a point where the catch and release ethic, the pendulum of that is maybe swung a little bit too far, and it's a little bit hard to get it in folks' head that it's okay to harvest that largemouth bass and take it home. It's actually in some situations, like I said, where I'm at, particularly one of my districts, it's got a lot of small reservoirs in it around Greensboro, Burlington, North Carolina, right along that I-85 corridor. And there are a few of those that definitely could use some more harvest, but it's hard. It's hard to encourage that.
Yeah, and it's right? Like ideally, it'd be great for people to be taking limits of 10 to 14-inch bass home, right? Like ideally not taking a limit of 2.5 to 3.5 pound largemouth.
Yeah, I really like the in-fisherman concept of selective harvest. Because it does two things at once. For one thing, there shouldn't be a stigma for keeping bass. There just shouldn't. I mean, you shouldn't have to worry about being threatened or anything like that, which I know people have just in the study.
Yeah, it's weird on Facebook. Like people jump on people really, and it's unfortunate. Now, it's one thing when somebody's got a stringer of like 4.5 to 6 pound smallmouth and they've got a whole limit of them.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
to me, they did buy their license. They do have their rights, but
right.
That's not ideal.
Yeah, and so that's the other part of it.
But if somebody's got a bunch of 1.5 to 2.25 pound largemouth and they want to eat them, like that's probably good for most of our lakes, to be honest.
Yeah, and so that's the other part of selective harvest that I like is that it and the way I think of it as a population dynamics person is replacement cost in terms of years. Okay, so and also how many of them are around at each size class, each age class. So fish die, right? They die without us ever doing anything because they don't live forever. They're not immortal. So, so there comes a point in every fish, you name it, no matter what species it is, there comes a point where these fish become the certain sizes, ages, whatever you want to think of it as, they start to become rare. And a lot of investment was taken. They jumped through a lot of hoops already, natural mortality hoops, to get where they are. So that is a judgment call, and that's why I kind of think of ages more than I think of sizes, because up north, that size, that length, is a much smaller number than it is down here. Ideally you want to harvest fish between like 2 and 4 years old, probably bass. Let's just say bass and keep it in the same group because it also varies by species. But assuming that your bass are living to be 10 to 12, which is what they are down here, you probably want to keep your harvest within ages 2 to 4, let's just say, maybe 5 occasionally, and if you do that, you're probably never going to hurt the population very much, because our natural mortality rates down here for bass are roughly 20 to 25%. That means every year, 20 to 25% of them just die.
Which means like every 5 years, basically the whole lake turns over. I mean, roughly. I mean, like on average.
Yeah. I mean, and so, you removing that fish isn't that big a deal, because, he's already got, not quite a coin flips, but he's got a high chance he's not going to make it to the next year anyway. A higher chance than any of us would want to have. You know what I mean? And so to think that you have to, that you have some horrible reason that you don't need to harvest that fish, like you said, down here, I would say 12 to 16-inch fish, bass, largemouth, or smallmouth even. I mean, Alabama bass, go ahead. If you want to keep them, keep them. I mean, you shouldn't, I wouldn't necessarily say keep 10 fish every time you go out there. But I mean, you want to keep them, because there's plenty of them. But yeah, if you're worried about how many big fish you want to have, then when they get to that 4 or 5 pound range, I think they're probably better off tossed back, because they have a much better chance of reaching 8 to 10 pounds than a 2-pounder, which has probably 1 in 100 chance of getting to 8 or 10. But by the time they get to 4 or 5, they've got a pretty good chance of getting bigger, because they've already jumped through multiple hoops of natural mortality.
And they've gotten to the size where they don't have a lot of natural predators. Right.
Exactly.
Right. Yep.
Exactly.
Well,
in my understanding of how why selective harvest, right? Each lake basically has a biomass that it can hold, right? So it can either hold, simple terms, it can hold 100 2-pound bass, right? Or it can hold 45-pound bass, right? Like, So to some degree, the reason lakes get stunted is because they get too many fish, right? And there's 1,000 1-pound bass that can't have any 10-pound bass.
And that's especially true up where you are, in all those natural lakes, because your lakes are the most stable ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems in the North American continent. Now, a lot of them have been around for 20 to 25,000 years, since the last ice age. They are at equilibrium. They don't have drastic water level changes. They don't have giant spates of water that flood through them. They're very stable. And so that is 100% true up where you are. They are all essentially at equilibrium, and have been for long before white people set foot on this continent, And so you have that situation up there where this is your biomass. Just how do you want it to be apportioned? That's what it is. Down here, it's a little more complicated, because our recruitment is not the same. Wet years and dry years and all really make a difference, and by the way, the Mississippi River is the same way. I mean, that's not stable, it's more than natural lakes, so there you can have these big year classes, or you can have crappy year classes, and your population can fluctuate. We really see that down here. And so it's not quite as easy, but you are 100% right that the whole northern third of the country, coast to coast, where well, at least from, I don't know if there are glaciers over in the Pacific Northwest or not. I'm more familiar with everything east of the Rockies, but there's that line where the glaciers carved all those natural lakes out, and I mean, they're all very stable ecosystems. And on the flip side of all that, I can't tell you, and I mean, I know I'm never going to win this battle, and I'm perfectly fine with it, but people who want to keep a trophy fish for the wall, I mean, sometimes I think they have to go to the confessional, because they're like, oh my God. I mean, and if someone dares to make a skin mount, they're like ostracized, it's like, oh my God. Well, I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't want to spend 3 times as much for the same mount. I tell people all the time, look, unless you're someone that has to have 50 fish mounts on the wall, which is rare, I don't think you're doing any problems keeping one big fish over your lifetime. You're not, and I mean, a big fish usually is near the end of its lifespan. You putting that back doesn't mean, if you put a 10-pound largemouth bass back, that doesn't mean it's going to be 12 pounds in a couple of years. It probably means it's going to be dead. So go ahead and keep that one fish, and if you want to. Nobody should be shamed about it, and nobody should feel remorse about it, and nobody should get on them about that either. I mean, it's
One
one in
other,
a lifetime.
yeah,
I don't. I mean, I have about 8 or 10 mounts, one of each species. Every single one of them's a skin mount, and I could care less. Because I'm done. I've got my largemouth on the wall. I'm never getting another one. I mean, uh, so you can get a little whack. There can be a little wackiness there. It's not just the harvest. It's also the poor people who want to keep a fish to mount, and they're acting like you took the neighbor's kid in to get them stuffed and put on your wall.
yeah. I'll also say too, something that people need to consider too when they think about this is, as fisheries management agency biologists, we take harvest into account when we set regulations. So we're, for the most part, we're counting on harvest. Slot limits were a big thing years ago. It was a concept that in theory would work, but we didn't have a lot of harvest below those slots. So, thinning those fish out on the front end. And so in most cases, we've taken those off just for that reason. But we do that when we set regulations, we build in harvest. So if you're worried about that, I don't know of there's been a handful, maybe, of bass populations over the years that have been adjusted because of, I won't say over harvest, but higher harvest than what we had originally thought was going to happen or whatever. But for the most part, our harvest levels are such that our regulations we don't even need them in some cases, really, because people aren't harvesting fish. Really, what we see in a lot of cases is it's limiting what folks at fish tournaments can bring in, to the scales. Is those limits are governing that. But I've only seen a few places, some of our coastal rivers, where we have some subsistence fishing going on, where people will harvest bass at a higher level. But for the most part, I think Steve was quoted the other day, like 3 to 5%, harvest.
In most of our reservoirs, that's 100% right. I mean,
yeah, it's really low.
Low 10%, way below natural mortality rate, and in a population dynamics context, a regulation's only doing something if harvest is roughly equivalent to natural mortality. Otherwise, most of the components of your mortality is natural, and you can put any regulation on there you want. You're not doing anything because natural mortality is controlling your size structure of the population.
So if harvest doesn't reach 10 to 20%, it's not going to matter.
It's what we call.
I would guess your natural mortality rate of bass up there might be more like 15%. So, because they live longer, they grow slower and live longer. So your natural mortality rate is certainly lower. So a lower level of harvest up there would still make a difference, if you will. But down here with our high mortality rate,
and obviously some of our smaller lakes could be more impacted easier than some of our bigger lakes because we have a lot of 500-acre lakes. So
yeah.
So Victor, to your point, make them taste like walleye. Well, first of all, bass are sunfish. I think most people agree that sunfish and crappie are delicious. Now, do I think 3 to 5 pound bass, when they get real thick and old, are good? Not really. But have you tried a 10 to 12 to 13-inch bass out of clean, cold water? They're pretty delicious. You can't tell the difference between I think I think it's a stigma, and I think if people had a blind taste test, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a bluegill and a bass, similar size.
Probably not. No.
And here's another fun fact: northern pike are delicious if you know how to fillet them. And I like to have a thing that says "Eat a pike, save a jackhammer." That's one of my personal slogans. So I think we need to harvest more small bass, and we need to harvest a lot more pike because tungsten is expensive. So
yeah, I did my master's work on northern pike in South Dakota. I learned how to fillet them things. They're good. I like them a lot.
And if you get them out of cool water, And they're, I mean, we get shallow pike out of warm water, and they get, they pike, some of the pike do get that kind of like slimy or wormy, or right. I mean, but if you get one out of cold water that's healthy and clean, they're delicious. So yeah, cool. Let's see if there's any other questions here. We're pretty much.
Somebody asked one that I'll answer real quick. They ask about aging fish. How do you tell the age of a fish? So years and years ago, biologists determined that scales were an aging structure. But what we found is that it's not really a good aging structure, and makes sense, right? Especially down here, up north, there is some utility potentially of them because you have that change in seasons and they lay different growth marks down, but scales can get rubbed off. They can regenerate. There are problems with them. Really the tried and true method is what's called an otolith, Otolith, and that translates to ear stone. It's a bone in the fish's inner ear, and it functions just like a tree ring, like rings on a tree. The positive of it is extremely accurate. The negative of it is it's lethal. So what we do here is we subsample fish. So if we're out, like my folks are out right now doing crappie sampling, and they're getting, some of these lakes are getting 500 and 600 fish a week, easy, setting nets. We're not killing 500 or 600 fish. We're taking a subsample of those, and then we'll extrapolate those information, the lengths and the weights and the ages. We'll extrapolate all that to the entire sample out. But it kind of what we've determined over the years is if you're going to invest in taking age data, that's something that's important to you, you're better off, taking the best you can get, because even if it does come at a little bit of a cost to a few fish, because accurate data is better than a lot of data that's not really accurate. That kind of makes sense, right? But so that's how we age fish. There's a few little exceptions out there for other species, but when we're talking about bass, otoliths are the way to go.
But I mean, for a person just fishing, length is a pretty good indicator, right? Like,
yeah, it
it's for somebody
depends.
that's trying to decide if it's an old fish or a young fish in Minnesota or Alabama, and they're just out fishing, and is this like a fish? I mean, like, there are rules and exceptions, but like in general, length is a pretty good indicator.
So a great way to find that out for where you're at is find out where your local fisheries management agency office is. Call a biologist up, and they're going to be able to tell you for that particular lake, because chances are they're going to have years and years of data if they've been there, the lake's been sampled, and they're going to be able to pull it right up and give you a pretty good estimate of what that is for that particular lake based on length.
Yeah, the reality is that, so length and age are pretty tightly linked up to a point. Fish age, length age plots, graphs, whatever you want to call it, they're basically like an asymptote. They rise and then they level off, and so and what happens is that there's a surprisingly high amount of individual variation in growth in fish, and so everybody toots along at a pretty good pace, and then when they all get sexually mature, then all of a sudden their energy that they're eating goes two directions. It goes into either growth or it goes into gonadal growth, and I think that invests a little bit more in females than it is in males, but there's a lot of things going on that honestly we don't even understand. That the individual variation in growth is fascinating, because you can start having some really crazy things. Down here, a 5-pound bass, 5-pound largemouth bass could be 6 years old, or it could be 10, depending on how good of a life they've had. So once you start talking about the big fish, it's a little harder to tell how old they are, because it is really crazy how there are just fast growing fish, and we're not sure if that's genetics or if it's something like this fish has just got it figured out, or its diet is slightly different. That work, as far as I know, has never been done on any fish, let alone these, maybe like aquaculture fish, but that's just artificial, But it's kind of fascinating. I mean, crappies are really notorious for that. I mean, they're crazy. Down here, we do something often where you can plot like after you age all your fish, you can do what scatter plots and just like length. And so you think about it, your ages are whole numbers, but the lengths are all kinds of numbers. So you end up with a bunch of overlapping points. And sometimes they're like those spread of those lengths can overlap over like 4 age classes. It's like, oh my God, what is going on here? I mean, there's 8-inch crappie that are 2 years old, and there's 8-inch crappie that are 6 years old. And so that's the extreme. Bass are usually not that bad, but yeah, it's a little harder than you would think to tell. You can get it like Lawrence said. You can call your DNR offices. They should be able to not only just give you an estimate over the phone anymore. They should be able to email you an honest to God. Like, I wouldn't even say. I mean, they might give you an equation if they're cruel, make you use a calculator, but they could also literally just say age 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 inches, and this is your average length at all of them for your lake or river or whatever. And that's good enough for you to know what it should be, with the realization that there is that individual variation, and it could be off by a couple years depending on whether you have a fast grower or a slow grower on your hands.
Awesome. Well, I feel like this is a good stopping point. We went a little over 2 hours. I appreciate your guys' time. I really enjoyed having the conversation. I know Steve Sammons is on Instagram. You can look him up. I'm sure he would love to answer all your biology questions about Alabama bass. And there's a link in the description of the report. I think we're gonna do a Friday night show with Baitman, and we're gonna get into some MLF talk, the real sizzly, exciting stuff. But tonight we had an occasional show, and I thought it was good, and we need to mix these in. And I appreciate you guys coming on.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Keep up the great work. I really appreciate you guys making time. If you guys came in late, bunch of good information. Rewind it, watch it on replay, watch it on Facebook, download on your favorite MP3. Just search HellaBass in your favorite podcast. You can catch the replay. Thanks again, guys. As always, we're here to help you catch more good big bass and suck less.